Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, which is happening tonight via Zoom. Biblical response to immigration, a foreigner among us at the border and at the border. And I wanted to cover just briefly what the topics are that we'll cover tonight, and then give some instructions briefly about question and answers. And then I will hand this over to our first panelist. So this evening, we will be covering a couple of different points. The first one is a biblical framework to think about immigration, and Matt Sorens will be sharing with us on that. And we'll have question and answers immediately after that to address to Matt. And so if you guys will go ahead and as you have some questions, go ahead and type that into the Q&A section there, the little button that you see at the bottom, and then I will then be asking Matt the questions. After Matt, we will hand it over to Danilo and Sammy Di Pasquale. Danilo, Zach, works for the National Immigration Forum, and Sammy works for Abara, which is a ministry that works at the border, and they will be sharing with us an update on what's happening at the border, both from a national perspective and then very specifically what's happening in the El Paso area. And then after that, we'll have a section where we will be discussing dreamers, and we'll be learning some from Vivian Paris Chandler, who is a dreamer, and from Adam Essel, who's also from the National Immigration Forum. Finally, we will be covering a brief section on refugees, and Rob Castle will be taking us through some information there. And so, as I mentioned, please be typing in your questions, and I will then moderate those questions as we hit each of the Q&A sections after each speaker block. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Matthew Sorens, who will kick us off with the biblical foundation.
Thank you so much, Andre. It is great to be at least virtually with you all tonight. As Andre said, my name is Matthew Sorens. I'm the national coordinator for the Evangelical Immigration Table. I also work at World Relief. So Rob is my colleague there in North Carolina. And today I usually work out of the Chicagoland area, but I'm actually at the moment here in El Paso, Texas with my friends at Ibarra. So you'll be hearing from Sammy shortly. And I'm also down here in El Paso, really eager to have a better sense of what's happening on the ground here. But before we jump into those realities of refugee resettlement and what's happening at the border, I wanted to start our conversation by really grounding us in how do we think about this issue from a biblical perspective. One thing that is really important to us at the Evangelical Immigration Table and at World Relief is that our thinking about these issues starts first and foremost from the scriptures. And that's important, I think, in particular, because frankly, we can't presume that that's always the lens through which even Christians are thinking about these issues. Often we've thought about issues of immigration from what we've heard on the news, or as a political issue, or cultural issue, an economic issue, a security issue. But we know from polling that relatively few evangelical Christians actually think about immigration from a biblical perspective. In fact, a few years ago, we commissioned a survey from Lifeway Research and asked self-described evangelical Christians what was the most important factor influencing their views on the topic of immigration. And only 12% managed to say the Bible. They told us in preparing the survey that if you ask evangelical Christians any question, and one of the choices is the Bible, many of them will select it instinctively without whether or not it's actually true. But apparently, even with that bias at play, only 12% of evangelical Christians said the Bible was the most important view on their thinking about immigration. In fact, the Bible came up less often than the Bible, my local church, the views of national Christian leaders. Those categories combined were mentioned less often than the media. So often people in our churches have thought about this from the perspective of CNN or Fox News or something on Facebook or Twitter, but too rarely have we thought about it as a biblical issue. So this evening, I just want to look at some of the core biblical principles that I really believe ought to be informing our views on this topic. So we'll start with this, that Jesus himself was a refugee as a small child. or maybe an asylum seeker. I'll make the distinction in a moment, but you can see the picture there. This is a nativity set that my wife and I got as a wedding present some years ago. And a couple of years later, when we had our daughter Zipporah, probably when she was about 3 years old, this was just like her favorite toy for the whole month of December. She would act out the Christmas story, with Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus and cute animals and wise men and shepherds and angels. But Zippy turned to me one day and said, "Dad, our nativity set is missing someone. We don't have the angry king." And of course, I knew exactly who she was talking about because I had read her the nativity story in our storybook Bible many times. And it got me thinking, I've never actually seen a nativity set with a King Herod figurine. And that tends to not be our favorite part of the story. But it is part of the nativity story. As soon as the wise men, the magi, are back on their way back to their country, Joseph is warned in a dream that Herod, this paranoid, tyrannical Middle Eastern king, was coming to kill all the little boys in Bethlehem. And Joseph was told in a dream to get up in the middle of the night to take Jesus and Mary and escape, crossing the border into Egypt, outside of Herod's dominion, where they would be safe. I said Jesus is a refugee. That is the definition of a refugee is someone who has fled a credible fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. Under US law, there's a distinction. An asylum seeker is someone who claims to be a refugee. That is to say they have a well-founded fear of persecution, but unlike refugees who are identified overseas and then a small percentage are selected and invited to come to the United States, asylum seekers are people who show up along the border at a place like here in El Paso or Tijuana or Brownsville or anywhere along the border, or at an airport with a temporary visa. And they say, well, I have a credible fear of persecution. And on that basis, please let me stay here and be safe. Of course, we don't know very much about from Jesus' story. Matthew chapter 2 doesn't give us many details. We don't know if the Egyptian government was aware that they were present or what they thought of them. We don't know how they were treated by the Egyptian people. It's very possible that some people had compassion on the Holy Family. It's also quite possible that there was people who were suspicious of them, who might have said things like, "How do we know that you're fleeing from Herod and not spies sent by him?" Or, "You know what, Joseph, we've got enough carpenters in this economy without you stealing a job." That's all speculation. But what's not speculation is for the tens of millions of people in our world today who are refugees or asylum seekers or other migrants, they have someone in Jesus who can very personally identify with that experience of having to cross the border. Another core biblical theme is that we believe that all human beings, including every immigrant, is made in the image of God. And Christians have historically understood this to mean that human beings have unique inherent dignity, which gives us a motivation to want to do everything reasonably possible to protect those fleeing persecution and harm. Not only that, though, being made in the image of God also means that people have potential because they are made in the image of a creator with this potential to create, to contribute. And I think sometimes when we talk about issues of immigration, we quickly brush over that. We tend to think about, well, what is this going to cost us? How much are those people going to take? How many jobs are they going to take? Well, that's a fair question. It's a reasonable question, but it's only really a reasonable question if we're concurrently asking the question, how many jobs are those people going to create? And the reality is, immigrants have created a ton of jobs in this country. Just looking at big businesses, 44% of the Fortune 500 companies in this country were founded by an immigrant or their child, not to mention many, many small businesses. And whether you're looking specifically at refugees who've been resettled or other categories of immigrants, even immigrants who are undocumented, who don't have any legal status, economists are almost universally in agreement that while there are costs, the benefits and contributions are greater than the costs. And it's a net economic benefit for the country that receives those individuals. And that's rooted in the reality that these are people made in the image of a creator God with that potential to create, to contribute. Another core biblical theme is that we know from the Old Testament in particular that God has a particular concern for those who are vulnerable. And in the Old Testament, there's often three categories of people who get mentioned in the same passages. It's the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. Or depending upon your translation of the Bible into English, you might see sojourner, stranger, alien, immigrant. It's the Hebrew word ger, and that word alone appears 92 times just in the Old Testament. It's actually one of the more frequent themes in the Hebrew scriptures. And God is very clear, not only does he love these vulnerable people, but then he commands his people to love them as well and to emulate his character. We also find in the Old Testament and then repeated in the New Testament this command to love our neighbors as ourselves. And it's interesting, in Leviticus 19, when that command appears for the first time, it's just a few verses later. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. And then, when a foreigner resides with you in your land, you shall not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you shall be to you as your native born. You shall love them as yourselves. So even if we were just working off Leviticus chapter 19, we could conclude that that command to love has very broad ramifications. But in the Gospels, when Jesus is asked, well, what's the greatest commandment? He affirms it's to love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. But the lawyer, the legal scholar who's asking him these questions in Luke chapter 10, tells us in the text he wants to justify himself. So he has a follow-up question. Well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus doesn't respond with a precise legal definition, which is apparently what this legal scholar would have liked. He responds with the story of the Good Samaritan, the story of this presumably Jewish person beaten up, left to die on the side of the road to Jericho. And a priest and a Levite, the religious leaders at the time, come by, they see him in need, and they pass by on the other side. But then a Samaritan, someone who was ethnically different, who was of a totally different religious tradition, and not only different, but one that was frankly despised by most Jewish people at the time. He comes along, he sees this person in need, and he has compassion on him. He takes him to get help. Jesus says, go and do likewise. Be like that Samaritan. And of course, one takeaway from that story is that the definition of a neighbor that this legal scholar was looking for can be very broad. We certainly cannot narrowly define it to people who share our ethnicity or our religion or any other qualifier. It could be just about anyone who's in need. And it's also important to note that there's no caveat to that command. It doesn't say love your neighbor so long as it's completely safe. The reality is it was not completely safe for the Samaritan in that story to stop and linger on a road that had a reputation as a dangerous road, the sort of road where people got beaten and robbed and left to die. And that might be one reason why the priest and the Levite in that story went by on the other side. From a human perspective, that would be the prudent thing to do late at night on a dangerous road, is get out of there as quickly as you can. But our hero in this story, the model of neighborly love that Jesus presents for us, is someone who did put himself at some risk. And I hear that and I think about some of the partners that I know World Relief has worked with, churches in the Middle East and elsewhere over the years, who are serving an incredible number of displaced people who've just come across the border, who have not necessarily been through a thorough vetting process. And they're not paranoid if they wonder if there's some risk involved, but they're serving them anyway, not because they're sure it's safe, but because they were never under the impression that following Jesus was going to be safe. And the irony in the United States context is we have a very, very different context. It is actually incredibly safe to welcome refugees, for example, in the United States. Because again, refugees are individuals who were identified by the US government abroad. They go through an incredibly thorough vetting process. It's a process that usually takes somewhere between a year to 2 years to complete. It's actually the most thorough vetting process that our government has for any category of visitor or immigrant who comes into the United States. And the best evidence of that is working is since the Refugee Act was passed into law in 1980, there's been more than 3 million refugees resettled to the United States, and not a single one has taken the life of an American citizen in a terrorist attack. That is an incredible record. Now, someone might reasonably say, okay, well, refugees they all come with legal status, they go through this unique vetting process. What about someone who snuck across the border? They were not vetted before coming into this country. And I think that's a legitimate concern. And we've been really clear at World Relief and at the Evangelical Immigration Table for a long time. We think it's appropriate to have secure borders, for our government to know who's coming into the country and to do everything reasonably possible to keep out anyone who would be seeking to do harm. What's not reasonable is to presume that those who have come in unlawfully, most of whom have been here 10, 15, 20 years, are disproportionately a threat to public safety. And we can say that because they've had plenty of time to commit crime if that was their intention, with many of them having been here a very long time. And actually the data consistently shows that immigrants, whether they're lawfully present or not lawfully present, actually commit crimes at significantly lower rates than native-born US citizens. That's not to say that there's never any crime committed, but again, it's disproportionately lower than US citizens. That's also not to say you should be afraid of your US citizen neighbors, just that it is not particularly rational to be afraid of your immigrant neighbors, regardless of whether they're here lawfully or not. Another dynamic that I think is important as we think about refugees and asylum seekers is these are people fleeing persecution. And one factor that I think people may miss out on sometimes is that many of them are persecuted, particularly because of their Christian faith. And that gives us this unique opportunity to stand with the persecuted church. It is actually their faith in Christ that in many cases has made them refugees in the first place, that they were forced out of their own countries. When we welcome those people, we have the opportunity to welcome Jesus. In Matthew 25, Jesus says, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. It's also important to know that when the US does less in terms of taking refugees or shutting down asylum, we're of course taking fewer persecuted Christians and making it more difficult for those people to reach safety. Of course, the flip side to a lot of refugees and other immigrants being Christians, and in fact, the plurality of refugees who are settled in the United States are Christians. The significant majority of all immigrants are Christians of one background or another. But there also are those of other faith traditions. And for some Americans, if we're honest, and some Christians, that makes people uncomfortable. They see that as a potential threat. But our view has always been that it is actually a remarkable opportunity for the church. And an opportunity to live out the Great Commission to make disciples of all nations, because you have people from every country in the world who end up here in the United States in this context of religious freedom, where we are free to share our faith and people are free to receive it or to reject it. And to be really clear, we want to fully respect people's religious freedom. We don't do proselytism. We don't trick them into following Jesus or say, we'll serve you better if you pray this prayer. But we do believe in evangelism rightly understood, which is an open invitation to a relationship with Christ. And very often that's going to happen in response to a question. Because when it's a team from a local church that meets a family at the airport or along the border and welcomes them and loves them as their neighbor, which we are called to do, whether they would ever share our faith or not, it's rare that sooner or later there's not that question of why. Why do you love us so much? And we get to, as 1 Peter 3 says, to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is within you. And in this wonderful context of religious freedom, we've seen people make the decision to follow Christ, again, of their own volition, not under any sort of pressure, but because they have seen the best of the church reflecting the love of Jesus. And one other dynamic that I think is important biblically is the command in Romans chapter 13 to be subject to governing authorities. And this is particularly relevant because not all immigration to the United States is lawful. And so it is important to note that most immigration is lawful. So about 3/4 of immigrants in the United States have lawful status, but about 1/4 of immigrants in the United States are unlawfully present. They are undocumented. They either came across the border unlawfully or they overstayed a temporary visa. It's about 11 million people total. And for a lot of Christians, this is a real tension point because on the one hand, we want to love and welcome people, to share the gospel with people, but we also want to respect the law. And so what do we do when some people are not present lawfully? Well, the good news is that if we take our laws seriously, there's nothing in those laws that would limit a church as an institution or an individual Christian from showing kindness and compassion to their immigrant neighbors, regardless of if we think we know what their legal status is. It's not against the law to have someone over for a meal, even if they're undocumented, or for a church to teach English classes. There's no law that says if you suspect someone is unlawfully in the country, you're required to report that. You're not. So there's not really a tension point for citizens or for churches. Where this is harder is for our brothers and sisters in Christ who are not lawfully present and who, in my experience, usually desperately want to get right with the law, but simply don't qualify to do so under our existing laws. And some of them have made the decision to go back to their countries of origin or because they are often Christians who take Romans 13 seriously. But others have said, well, I'm also called to provide for my family. 1 Timothy, that's a biblical command. And in some cases, going back would actually be putting your family in danger. So it's a real tension point. What we've said at the Evangelical Immigration Table for a long time is there ought to be a way for our policies to change so that families could stay together, but also that we would respect the law. So that's not an amnesty that says you broke the law, it's forgiven and forgotten, but there would be a way for people to come forward, pay a fine as restitution for having violated immigration law, which in my experience, most would be very eager to do, and then have the opportunity to earn permanent legal status and eventually citizenship if they'd meet appropriate qualifications. If you pair that with making it harder to immigrate illegally, so improve border security, but also making it easier to immigrate legally, so fixing our antiquated visa system, I think that would actually go a long way towards addressing some of the challenges of our immigration system. It would be much more humane and it would honor the law. And one way we've done that at the Evangelical Immigration Table is encouraging our elected officials to pursue something we call restitution-based immigration reform. So really framing this as a middle way between amnesty or mass deportation, but a way for people to make things right and eventually earn citizenship in this country. One other note on Romans 13 is if we take Romans 13 seriously and respecting the law, it's also important to note that there are laws that are designed to protect the vulnerable. So, for example, the law in the Refugee Act of 1980 that gives people the right to request asylum. I think we'll hear from Sammy and Danilo in a minute. That's not a law that's actually being honored right now. And the argument legally is, well, there are other public health laws that say that we don't have to follow the law in a public health emergency. But our view has been that it's really vital that we figure out a way to both protect public health, which is frankly a lot easier now with vaccines and widespread testing than it was a year ago, and to respect our laws that offer protection to those with a credible fear of persecution. Likewise, we have a law that governs how unaccompanied children are treated. So the law is pretty clear that if you are an unaccompanied minor, you should be turned over from the Border Patrol to the Department of Health and Human Services within 72 hours. And that's designed to make sure that children are not sent back to dangerous situations and that they have due process while our government figures out if they qualify to stay permanently. So it's really important, if we take Romans 13 seriously, that we also honor those laws as well. Last thing I want to note is this is a picture, actually, I got this earlier today, not from the border I'm at today in El Paso, but this is in Tijuana. This is a picture my colleague Jose sent to me of it's a large crowd of people who have, in most cases, been expelled from the border in Tijuana or in San Diego and under that public health rule that I mentioned. And it's an overwhelming number of people. Likewise, if you look in some of the shelters for unaccompanied children, it's a large number of people. Here in El Paso, Fort Bliss is hosting more than 4,000 children in a health and human services facility there. And I think the response to a very large crowd of very needy people can very easily be what the response of the disciples was when they had a crowd of more than 5,000 people, men, women, and children. It can be send those crowds away. And even sometimes in the disciples' case, and sometimes in our cases, with a sort of a veneer of compassion, send them away so they can get help somewhere else. But Jesus' response, I think, is instructive in Matthew chapter 10, when he sees this crowd of 5,000 people. He tells the disciples, you give them something to eat. And of course, the disciples do not have enough for 5,000 people to eat. And that's often how we can feel as well. We don't have the solution for a large unaccompanied child crisis. We don't have the ability to change immigration policy on our own. But I think what Jesus is asking us to do is to give up to him what we do have, whether that's our voice or our time or our resources and our credibility to challenge others to think biblically about this issue, and to entrust him to do what only he can do with the little that we have to offer. So I'll stop there. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Andre, but I think we have some time for Q&A if people have questions.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions. If you have any more questions, please help me out and go ahead and put them up on the Q&A function. But first question is from me. That picture that you showed, was that today? Like that happened this week?
That's today. It was a couple hours ago.
So this is like happening right now. This isn't like it happened like a year ago or a few months ago. Like these crowds of people that are being sent back and are in this, like in these tents, or it's happening right now, right?
Yeah. And honestly, I mean, I've been to that plaza in Tijuana many times, and I've never seen it quite like that. I mean, there's been lots of people waiting in Tijuana before, but it's usually a little more organized in stadiums or in different shelter facilities. World Relief works with a church partner there in Tijuana that, the church has been converted into a shelter for many years now, but there's just not enough space. And people are basically backing up right along the border at this point, which also is a reminder that you hear the rhetoric of, oh, the borders are open. Clearly the borders are not open, or those people would not be sleeping on the southern side of it.
Yeah, and we'll get a more detailed update of what's happening at the border next. But I wanted to ask this question that you touched on a little bit, but maybe you can go in a little bit into more detail. Is it how do we balance the concerns for mercy and justice with the need to respect the rule of law?
Yeah, that's really what we're trying to get at with this restitution-based immigration reform proposal. I mean, I think sometimes on both the right and the left politically in the United States, you have a really unhelpful false dichotomy, with one side saying, well, they want open borders and amnesty, and the other side saying they want to deport everybody and close the borders. And realistically, neither of those extremes are particularly likely policy solutions. We live in a globalized society. I think our government recognizes that we depend very significantly on immigration in this country. And at the same time, there's not a lot of people saying, well, we should have insecure borders. I think everyone basically agrees we should have secure borders. Our government should know who's coming in. That's the responsibility of government. The question is, who's allowed to come in lawfully? And given a very dysfunctional system for many decades now, what should we do with people who are not here lawfully? And what we've tried to do is say there's a middle way that says the law is important. We're not saying the law doesn't matter, which is what an amnesty does. It's sort of forgive and forget that there was a violation of law. We're saying the law was violated. What's an appropriate penalty? Well, in most cases, of course, there'll be a very small number of cases where people have committed more serious offenses, and then they would be disqualified and potentially have to be deported. But for people who've come into the country unlawfully, but then been living here 15 years and working, and in many cases filing their taxes, people don't realize that you can file and pay your taxes even without permanent legal status or a valid social security card. It seems to me that an appropriate penalty would be a monetary fine. The same way I recently paid a fine for my children losing a Berenstain Bears book at the library. I don't think that was unjust, that I am being held to account because I did violate a rule. It didn't require any malice. It didn't require, I didn't harm anyone, but I'm making amends for that. And we think that would be a way to both honor the law while also avoiding the dynamic of, if you ask people, what is your solution? If they don't like that, they if you press them, well, do you think we should deport everyone who's here unlawfully? You're then talking about more than 4 million US born children whose parents are going to be deported, or at least one parent. That's a humanitarian nightmare. I mean, we've had family separation of parents and children in the last few years, and I don't think it was very popular, but this would be on a much larger scale, and of families that have grown up in the United States. So if we don't like that, and we don't want to just do an amnesty that just ignores the law, we think this is a way forward that honors the law and is compassionate and humane. And by the way, there's categories of people who I think should be exempt from that fine. If you're brought here as a 5-year-old, it doesn't make sense to hold you responsible for a decision that you didn't actually make. If you were forced across the border against your will and trafficked, likewise, I think there should probably be an exception there. But for the normal people who, under understandable circumstances sometimes, and I think it's important to understand how literally impossible the legal immigration system is for many of these people, or what was. But most of them, in my experience, I go to a Spanish-speaking church where the mass majority of people I know who are in this circumstance would be thrilled to get right with the law. I mean, pay a fine, go through whatever forms and hoops and lines they need to go through. But people are not in the shadows voluntarily. They're there because it's the only option to them under current law.
So we have a question here. How can we find out about lawmakers in North Carolina that are in support of restitution-based reform? Are there any that have come out in support of this?
I don't know that any have embraced it by name. I think it'd be great to call your senator's offices. I know the Evangelical Immigration Table has some tools for that, has a sign-on letter for that, and I think we'll probably follow up with that. You'll probably get a response back. It'll be probably kind of a form letter, but someone is reading that letter, and if they start to see a bunch of letters that use that language, I hope it'll resonate with them. I think there's actually a lot of, in the Senate in particular, this is really important, in the House as well, but for Dreamers, for example, a bill's already gone through the House. So if it could get through the Senate, or some version of a bill like that, the president has said he would sign it, which would be a real opportunity. But I'm hopeful we'll see that move forward in the coming weeks.
Has this concept been presented to the senators in North Carolina? Do you know?
Yes, because we were at a call with the Evangelical Immigration Table, well, with their staff at least. I don't know if the senators themselves have heard it, but at least their staff, we've had those conversations. But I think it would be great for them to hear, and again, calling their offices, leaving a voicemail or a message with their staff. Some of you might know your senators. Call their cell phones. That would be great to, to check in on that, on what they think about this idea.
Well, good.
It's a little bit of a reframing of an idea that's not that new. It's pretty much what President Bush proposed in 2006 and what President Obama proposed in 2013. It's just sort of a reframing that we think helps make it more politically feasible.
Yeah. I'm going to take one more question here. And we just want to hear kind of how the response given kind of what we've been talking about, the biblical based approach. How has the response been across the country given our current political climate?
Well, as we're all aware, the current political climate is pretty challenging. People are sort of in their corners political on partisan lines. But I would say on Capitol Hill, there's there's more people quietly wanting to work together on a bipartisan basis than I think people might presume. And they're looking for the backing of their voters, especially, frankly, their primary voters on either side, Republican or Democrat, to kind of give them the permission to work with the other team and to not see them as the other team, but fellow Americans who they have to work with if anything is going to get done. And that, I think, is why it's so important for people to be a part of advocacy. Advocacy is, it's Proverbs 31 verse 8, to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Or in this case, not people who cannot speak for themselves, but people whose voices are not being heard by our elected officials. And to elevate those voices, I think, is really an important role for the church right now.
Well, I'm going to thank you, Matt, for this. This has been great. I think we could talk for another hour. I'm starting to get a lot of questions, some of them around the border. And so we're going to save it for the next section, since that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. And so thank you, Matt. We're going to bring on Danilo and Sammy Di Pasquale, if you want to turn on your cameras. And they will be talking about what's happening at the border. So I'm going to hand this over to Danilo and then Sammy after that.
Thanks so much, Andre. And I'll just try to give a brief, 5-minute broad update on the state of play at the border. My name is Danilo Zak. I'm a policy and advocacy associate at the National Immigration Forum, where I focus on border issues, among some other things. So just going to give a state of play, which I hope will help us get a little bit past some of the headlines and rhetoric and look towards solutions. And I'll try to give some of the statistics we've been seeing recently. Although, with those broad numbers, I think it's always important to remember that behind those statistics are individual stories, individual people, many of them fleeing persecution, seeking humanitarian protection, each of them deserving of dignity. And I hope that we can get into that more in the Q&A, and perhaps Sammy can speak more on the ground to some of these stories and what he's seeing. But wanted to start just to level set a little bit. Matt gave a really helpful definition of who asylum seekers are, which are many of the folks arriving at the border. So there are similarities to refugees, as Matt mentioned, but US law enshrines the legal right for those fleeing persecution to seek and obtain protection and humanitarian protection at our border, and even from within the US as well. So while refugees are sort of resettled from abroad, asylum seekers are those who come to our border to seek protection from persecution. And it's important to recognize that not everyone who arrives at the border is eligible for asylum, and seeking asylum and humanitarian protection is really a complicated legal process that involves a number of stages and requires migrants to repeatedly provide evidence and testimony to substantiate their eligibility. It can take years for that process to happen. And there's also issues with providing legal counsel. They're not, asylum seekers are not guaranteed legal counsel. So that's a sort of a separate issue. But I wanted to provide that definition before giving sort of this broad overview. But we have seen, certainly, as many of you likely have heard, an increase in arriving migrants over the past several months. And this increase actually started in the middle of last year, around April, and it's sort of continued this spring. So in February and March, we saw large increases in arrivals. I think in March, we saw around 170,000 total arrivals at the border, which is the highest number in at least 15 years. Although we do know that number was a little bit inflated by double counting of those who are crossing over and over again in the same period, which I'll get into a little bit more. And so with those high numbers, I did want to point out that in recent weeks, we have seen the number of arriving migrants level off a little bit. So the total number of arrivals in April was around the same as the number in March, about 170,000, although we're still waiting on official statistics from Customs and Border Protection. And one thing I really wanted to make clear, and Matt mentioned this, is that right now the border is not open, despite what some folks are saying. So ports of entry are closed to asylum seekers, and all arriving single adults and many families continue to be immediately expelled to Mexico or to their home countries under Title 42, which is sort of the health-related protocols that Matt discussed. So even if these folks fear persecution and want to make a claim for asylum and protection, they're still being turned away. in many cases. So, and in some cases, that's actually driving up the overall number of arrivals because it's such an expedited return that some single adults are attempting to cross again and again because they've been returned, within an hour. And so I did want to make that point that most people are still being turned away, even those seeking protection at the border, which is a concern. But there are some particular groups who the administration is letting in to pursue their asylum claims in court, and I want to touch on those. So one is families with particular vulnerabilities. So many families with children under the age of 7, for example, are being let in. And then the other big group is unaccompanied children, which I will get into as well, and I know has caused a lot of concern for a number of folks, and we've been very concerned as well with the treatment of unaccompanied children. So beginning with families, they are largely being released in the US with notices to appear in court or with booking records after parents are photographed and fingerprinted. Some of the families being let in were part of the Migrant Protection Protocol, which was a Trump administration policy that required migrants to wait in Mexico while their asylum cases proceeded, often in very dangerous locations in northern Mexico. And the administration is working closely with NGOs and in particular groups of faith at the border to help sort of house and care for these vulnerable families as they arrive. And from what we hear, and maybe Sammy can provide some more details on that, and that process is going fairly well. I did want to touch quickly on unaccompanied children, which has brought a lot of concern for folks. So we did see a record number of unaccompanied children arrive at the border, although that figure also appears to have leveled off a little bit in April. So around 18,000 per month are children without their parents who are arriving at the border. And it has posed a real challenge to the administration's border response. So as Matt mentioned, when children at the border are determined to be unaccompanied, they are brought first to CBP, Customs and Border Protection Processing Centers, which are really not meant to house children, especially for a prolonged period. And so according to the law that Matt mentioned, which was actually passed under the Bush administration to prevent trafficking of children, all unaccompanied children have to be transferred really quickly within 3 days to Health and Human Services shelters under the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And then eventually the idea is to get those children onto their sponsors and family members. Upwards of 80% of these kids have family members in the US that they can be sent to while their immigration court cases proceed. So in February and March, we saw a real increase in unaccompanied children, resulted in a backup in the HHS shelters, and then a lot of children stuck in CBP for a prolonged period, which was really problematic. And in response, the administration's opened at least 15 emergency facilities to expand shelter capacity, and the number of unaccompanied children in CBP custody has dropped dramatically, over 90%. And the average time spent in CBP facilities, which again are not meant to house children, has dropped below a single day as well, which is really good. So we are seeing more tempered numbers. We're seeing a little bit of success there, but that doesn't mean that there's not a serious challenge at the border that we still need to respond to, and we need to help support some of the groups at the border that are doing a lot of that really, really important work. I did quickly want to point out that this challenge isn't new. We've seen it in 2014 and 2016. We saw a large increase in 2019 after the most restrictive policies of the Trump administration were put in place. So it doesn't seem like restrictions really are what will deter migrants. It's really more about those root causes that are pushing migrants to the border, like economic insecurity, violence, and hurricanes and things like that. So I really think we don't need to sacrifice border security efforts to treat arriving children and others fleeing persecution with humanity and dignity, but wanted to turn it over to Sammy to talk a little bit more about what he's seeing at the border and in El Paso.
Thanks, Danilo, Andre, Matthew. It's great to be here. My name is Sammy DiPasquale, and I'm the director of an organization called Abara, and I am in El Paso, Texas, right across from Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. Abara it's rooted in Semitic languages, the meaning, and it actually means river ford or crossing, or very similar to El Paso. And sort of our vision is a growing community of peacemakers who seek to cross divides and move toward living in right relationship with each other. And so we try to provide opportunities and gathering spaces for people to connect, learn, and engage across divides. In our context here, of course, being in the border community, we have a great setting for that. And our hope is that as we connect, as we see, sort of as is mentioned, sort of every human being as another human being, hear stories, develop relationships, hopefully enter into the situation with a little bit of humility and learn history and context and meet new people, then we get creative in how we move forward, because this isn't just an issue, these are friends, right? And so we want to help, even if it's not completely a new friend, at least another human being, not just an issue, with thousands of, just dealing with numbers, right? Thousands of people. So here we are, we're located, the center I'm in right now is probably 1 mile or so from the US-Mexico border. Ciudad Juarez and El Paso form a massive binational metropolis where half of the city is in one country basically and half in the other, or name 2 different cities, but really one metropolis. And I think it's important to understand that we, being on the border, and even the name, right, El Paso, the pass, the crossing, right? This is a space, this is nothing new in terms of being a space of people moving back and forth one way or the other. This is the location, the physical location where Juan de Oñate, the very final conquistador from Spain, who came over and colonized what's now the US, literally he came through in El Paso. And but he was following earlier indigenous routes. And then it was like a period of, 200-300 years of commercial trade and traffic along these routes and people moving back and forth. So I think, a lot of times we hear it framed in terms of a crisis at the border, as if like nothing happened before then or after then. It's just like there's a crisis at the border. But I think it's really important to really try to understand root causes. Where are people coming from? Where are they going? What's the context? And the church has been here and has been responding, and faith communities have been responding through the hundreds of years that the church has been around in this area. And so what we're seeing day to day on the ground right now is we've got sort of 4 categories of people in our context here that tie into what's already been shared about the broader US-Mexico border context. But we've got those who are in MPP, have been stuck for 1.5 to 2 years in Mexico, in our case in Juarez, that are now slowly being processed through. As was mentioned by Danilo, it's been an extremely smooth process. Of all the processes that I've witnessed over the last 15 or more years, I think this has probably been the most smooth, because it's known who's entering. There's this incredible cross-border collaboration, all the way from UN agencies and affiliated agencies to Mexican and US government officials, to both like state, county, city officials, and then all the way down to small NGOs and churches. And so, for instance, we're part of a welcoming committee that's sort of a quiet group locally here in El Paso that is at the port of entry, or where you exit when you cross the border, to greet those who have just come through via MPP, or the Migrant Protection Protocols, right? So it was up to about 150 a day who were coming through. And some, because they know they're coming across and almost nobody is staying here, they're all passing on to stay with sponsor families elsewhere. Some already have bus tickets or plane tickets, and so it's just guiding them to where they can get to the airport. But first, there'll be a little printing station down the block where they can print out the forms they need. And then if they need a place to stay, then there's buses, which is county funding to another nonprofit that does transportation and takes them to a different nonprofit where they can shelter at Annunciation House for the night, and they can figure out sort of the next steps. But at all levels, it's like faith communities sort of engaging, and church communities, and people sort of, as like from what Matthew was sharing earlier, people who say, my neighbor is this person who's in front of me right now, and I need to help. And it's really amazing to see that. And with the numbers being very large, a number of years ago, there was a network of up to 30 churches, mostly churches, in El Paso that were serving as temporary shelters for asylum seekers. After MPP, all of a sudden you had the same, but across the border in Ciudad Juarez, and it just sort of ballooned. The numbers did, because they weren't just passing through; they're sort of stuck there for a while. But it was almost all churches that were responding, and these are not wealthy, well-resourced churches, as as you would identify them in that way at all. Many are very simple and don't have food necessarily to even pay their utility bills, but they say, how can I let this family stay on the ground in front of my church? Because here they are, even though it's extremely dangerous in some instances. And although, like for myself, to be across in Juarez, it's not that dangerous because of connections and the various privileges that come with a US passport and all. For migrant families coming from Central America, they're extremely vulnerable, especially if you can imagine a 21-year-old mom with an infant and a 2-year-old without any resources on the streets, having just been deported. It's getting dark, like it's a very, very vulnerable situation. So these churches are providing incredible shelter on that side. So you have that's the MP, what we're seeing with MPP. Those numbers are actually decreasing a little bit because of phase one. Most of those that were considered most vulnerable are already through here in El Paso. We are seeing with the Title 42 expulsions, those COVID-related, health-related sort of expulsions, some of those who are ending up in shelters, the most vulnerable of those, hopefully, are being identified by some legal-based nonprofits here in the US, because again, there's so much cross-border collaboration here that some of those are now being allowed to come through, again, even with asylum cases who were not under MPP. And that's like a new category that's fairly recent. We are also, as Matthew mentioned, I think there's a lot of unaccompanied minors who come through, but you do not see any of those on the streets. That's like for good reason, right? Just trying to protect kids and not have them be alone or released anywhere. So it's very complicated and there's a lot of layers, but yeah, those numbers have been very large, but we do not see those on the streets, and the churches can't really be involved in some way, or the faith community, unless as chaplains or even getting hired by some of the companies that are contracted or nonprofits that are contracted to serve them. Then in El Paso, we're in a maybe unique situation to some cities where there's been excess capacity here, or at least compared to other parts of the border. So for instance, when things were the numbers really increased highly in South Texas, in the Brownsville general area, you had Border Patrol flying people to El Paso to expel them here. And so the state of Chihuahua agreed to 100 a day. So you had 500 people a week being expelled, but they were flying in more than that. So it was sort of a little chaotic because there was no rhyme or reason as to the 100 that got expelled and say the 20 that didn't and could pursue their cases on US soil, and that created a lot of pain. And then some from Yuma more recently as well. So that's sort of the general situation, but I guess I would just end in saying, again, on every level of this sort of response, you are seeing faith communities who are often in the mix, working with government agencies, UN agencies, and other nonprofits and city and local government agencies.
Thank you so much for that update. We have time for one question, and it's a tough one. So I don't know who's going to want to take it, but either one of you can take it. The question is, my impression from extensive international travel is that most countries penalize illegal entry rather severely. Are you suggesting that such entry is not a serious violation?
Well, I'm happy to take this first, Sammy, and then you can go ahead. So the person who's asking the question is not wrong. There are plenty of countries that treat illegal entry severely, and in fact, I think we should be treating unauthorized entry as it's breaking the rules, so to speak. It is a civil violation in the U.S., not a criminal one. So when you go to immigration court, it's a civil court. You're not guaranteed a lawyer, all those things. The other thing I would point out, and I think is really important, is that there's just so few opportunities to come legally in the US system because it's so old and outdated. So if you wanted to, quote unquote, get in line, that can be extremely difficult, even if you have a family member in the US and can apply that way, or you have an employer who's willing to employ you and says, I want to give you a job. It still can take years and years, depending on which sort of category you can get in. It's such a complicated system that makes it really difficult. So I think one thing I always think is, we should really enforce a system once we have one that works. But when we have this broken system, it becomes so much more difficult to say this is a really serious infraction when it's someone who's, just trying to get in line and come across legally, but may not have that opportunity. In many cases, asylum seekers, for example, can't even apply for asylum at the legal ports of entry. They have to cross unauthorized and then submit themselves to a CBP agent and then apply for asylum at that point. So I think there are some nuances there that can add a little bit more context to that kind of conversation.
Sammy, I'm going to actually, there's a good question here that I want to go ahead and ask. I know you probably had some thoughts on that previous question, but I want to squeeze this one in because we're a little bit over on this section, but it's so interesting. The question is, being that the crisis continues before and beyond the border, what can we do in North Carolina to lend support for our neighbors who are traveling through the border areas? And do you have any networks across the states that we could connect with to continue to care for those seeking asylum once they pass through the border?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a lot of ways. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to get involved. There are groups providing direct services here on the border, on both sides of the border. For ourselves at Avara, we do some direct service, but mostly we're trying to funnel support to where it's needed most, whether it's trying to improve like provide funding to improve, make improvements to a shelter in Juarez, or provide emergency food if that's what's needed. I think also as we get away from the border, a few years ago, networks were starting to get established on these pathways, especially along bus pathways. And I know, for instance, in Virginia, in Roanoke, Virginia, they were coming through Tennessee and they knew they were going to be coming through Knoxville. So they had the phone number of the person in Knoxville who was sort of like meeting the bus and providing some food and maybe some toiletry items. And they had this network that sort of grew very organically. It wasn't masterminded in any way, but they'd realize, okay, this bus is just coming from Knoxville. How can I find the person in Knoxville? And then they would give information to the person in Charlottesville who could know, hey, there's 23 people on the bus and there's a kid who might need diapers. And that was fascinating and pretty amazing to see, sort of watch. So that might be the case that would emerge in North Carolina. I would say, though, probably maybe most importantly is trying to, whatever community you're in, to seek out people who are in with their sponsor families wherever you are, because they're there. Okay, they're and oftentimes in the shadows and scared. And again, by the way, just relating it to the previous question, this is not an illegal entry. They are here following a process and they're having a chance to follow this process. So it's not that with the asylum seekers, they're following an illegal pathway. But I think schools are a good place to check in to see maybe ESL. There are a lot of churches I've heard of around the country that have, and actually just had a pastor in here from Oklahoma last week where they had started working with some asylum seekers in Tulsa, and then started doing some sewing classes, and it turned into this amazing sort of community hub for a lot of the ladies in the community, and then it just sort of organically grew from there. So I would try to seek out maybe some who are being settled in your area. That would be a big way as well.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. This has been so interesting to hear this perspective from the border. And so thank you for spending some time just educating us a little bit this evening. I'm going to ask now Vivian Paris-Chandler and Adam Essel to come on, turn on your cameras and you'll come on board. Thank you. And they're going to be talking about the other extreme. So we were talking about those who just arrived now at the border, right? But now we're going to talk about a group of people who have been here for a very long time. And these are dreamers. And so I'm just going to hand this over to Adam, and then he'll hand it over to Vivian to educate us a little about who the dreamers are and what is the circumstance they're dealing with.
Great. Thanks so much, Andre. It's an honor for me to be with you guys today, live from Arizona. I'm Adam Essel. I'm the Vice President of Field and Constituencies with the National Immigration Forum. and a longtime advocate for immigrants in our community. So happy to have the opportunity to talk about these remarkable young people in all of our communities that were brought here by their parents, usually without authorization, although sometimes they came legally and then lost status, like one of my good friends. So I'll talk a little bit about the situation of who are dreamers, but then I think the real star of this panel is Vivian, who can share from her own experience about what it's like to be a dreamer in the United States. So actually the word dreamer comes from a piece of legislation that has not been passed, that was introduced 20 years ago, called the DREAM Act. And so from that legislative effort, we get the word dreamers, are young people brought here by their parents usually when they're very young, who many of them didn't choose to come to the United States. Most of them didn't even know what was happening or had any say in what was going on with their situation. But they're young people who are here now in our country contributing in all the states across the country. I think a lot of times people think of immigration as, a near the border situation, which may have been more true 20, 30 years ago, but now immigrants are all across the country, including in North Carolina. So you may have heard of something called DACA. So quickly to explain that, over the past 20 years, as our Congress has failed multiple times to pass a permanent legislative solution for these young people to be able to stay in the country and have a pathway, as Danilo was just mentioning, to stay permanently and contribute to the best of their abilities. President Obama in 2012 created the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which allowed young people, young dreamers, the opportunity to have a work authorization and for the most part, remove the fear of deportation on a very temporary basis. It's not legal status. I think it's important to note that only Congress has the power to grant legal status to a class of migrants, but it definitely did improve the lives of dreamers across the country, like Vivian, who will share her story in just a second. So DACA has been in place for about 9 years now, far longer than President Obama or anyone at that time thought that DACA would be relevant, as everybody has assumed that a permanent legislative solution for dreamers would be something that we could get done as a country. It's something that upwards of 80% of the American public agrees with, allowing these young people to stay permanently. And unfortunately, Congress has continued to kick the can down the road on this issue. The last thing I'll just comment, the current situation for some sort of DREAM Act is that the House of Representatives a while back passed the Dream and Promise Act that was a very generous pathway for a lot of our nation's dreamers. And we're very hopeful that the United States Senate, including senators like Tom Tillis in North Carolina, can lead the way on helping pass the DREAM Act in the Senate and get it to President Biden's desk as well. So with that being said, I'm happy to answer any questions later on, but I think I'll turn it over to Vivian, who can share a little bit from her experience of what it's like to be a dreamer in this country. So Vivian, over to you.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for the opportunity to share about what a dreamer is and what it's like. I do want to share that I am a former DACA recipient, but again, those experiences have shaped me into the person that I am today. So as children, we're told that we're leaving behind everything we once knew. As much as I cried and begged my parents to let me stay with my grandmother, friends, to continue going to school and what I knew, at age 11, the answer was a solid no. With a suitcase in my hand, my mom, my sister, and I flew into the United States. My parents focused on seeking opportunities. We stayed home as much as we could once the law changed to obtain licenses in North Carolina back in 2007. And my mom's license expired, causing her to drive illegally. We had to be home before nighttime, afraid of checkpoints, afraid to call the police for crimes done against us after our house got broken into, fearing the police would be the ones to deport us all. In my teenage years, I was naive, not knowing the complexities of what it meant to be undocumented. I arrived at the DMV with all of my required paperwork to receive my permit. But this is when I knew that I was different and that my opportunities were limited and what felt non-existent. It was time to apply to colleges. Not knowing what this all meant, the process of going to college was foreign, just like growing up in a hidden place. I remember staring at the computer wondering why, how, and what would be like if what my life would be like. I wanted to become an FBI agent. Watched too much CSI, if you ask my parents. I realized that I'd have to be a US citizen to become an FBI agent, which was impossible. My friends would apply and receive letters of acceptance to colleges, while I sat and wondered, will I be able to attend college? How will I ever afford it? I learned about continuing education programs that I could afford and enrolled to become a medical interpreter. I began working in 2012 as a contractor with an ITIN, how we say it in Spanish, and an ITIN is an individual taxpayer ID number. Saving every dollar and working the night shift, and immediately after getting off at 7 a.m., I would drive to my community college and nap for 20 minutes in the parking lot, only able to afford 1 to 2 classes per semester, as out-of-state tuition is usually 3 times the cost as it is for in-state tuition. One afternoon, June 15th, as Adam has actually shared, it was the day that President Obama announced the executive order for DACA. This day was the day where I rejoiced and my hope began to rise. I thought about the possibilities of obtaining a work permit and what I could do. I could finally work someplace like all of my friends did, get a license, open a bank account, and feel freedom. After applying, I realized that there were still many limitations. Applying every 2 years, go through meticulous background checks, have my driver's license with a limited term in red letters, which made people wonder what I did wrong every single time, and pay about $500 every 2 years with the hope that I would be able to continue to work legally and do all of these things. I still lived in feared that I would get a ticket or get pulled over. Wonder how I would pay for college because I still had to pay out-of-state tuition. I finished my associate's degree in computer science, and I had to pay out-of-state tuition for it all. In 2015, as I walked into Guilford Community College to submit my application for graduation, I received a phone call I never expected, that my second grandmother had passed away in Guatemala. I cried on the chair in the hallway as I held my paperwork. I walked to pay with tears in my eyes and went back to work. People with DACA can't just pack a bag and head down to visit their families. We have to apply for what's called advanced parole and then receive a notification that we can travel. I lost both of my grandmothers while living in the United States, not being able to say goodbye or to bury them. What many people don't know is that there's truly no pathway to citizenship from obtaining DACA. There is a very limited way to obtain a legal status, and after falling in love with the man that God placed in my path, we found a way. Because I came in legally and overstayed my visa, as you have heard, that is one of the ways that people come into the country, overstaying their visa. I had this immigration stamp, the I-94. The process for me was that my husband, who is a US citizen, was able to petition me to become someone with lawful status. With much fear still, I was granted a limited term with lawful status after paying about $785 for the application. What changed? I was able to continue my education and was finally able to receive in-state tuition. I finished my bachelor's degree after 10 years of graduating high school. It took me a long time, but again, that was something that I truly wanted to accomplish. And here behind me, you actually see a picture of me tossing my cap and all of the people that actually made a part of this possible. In my household, we are what we call a mixed status family. I was grateful that my sister did not have to go through the same barriers I did while I was growing up. She was able to get her permit at 15, began driving on her own at around 17, and she was able to go to college directly after graduating high school. How I felt was remorseful because she had the opportunities that I did not. But I was also grateful that she had this opportunity and did not have to face the same barriers and go through the same difficulties that I went through. Even though I am a former DACA recipient, my experiences, those of my friends living as dreamers, are still relevant. We all want to have the freedom to leave the United States when our family members' health deteriorates, work in our desired field, and reach the success we each have dreamt of. So that is a little bit of a story about me and what it's been like to live, undocumented as a DACA recipient, and what has changed for me now. I will share also that after obtaining DACA, I was able to realize that there was so much more out there, and I began volunteering with nonprofits. This was when many more opportunities, many more doors opened up for me. And today I can tell you that I am the executive director of a nonprofit organization, something that I never thought would be happening. And also that I applied for citizenship in December of last year. Again, something else that I never thought would be possible. So I am still waiting to hear back, and with hopes that it will happen. But even though there's a little bit of fear, just not knowing the unknown, I am grateful for all of these opportunities that DACA opened up for me. And it is truly, I mean, doors open. And even though we live in fear, it's a huge door that I think many people need to realize that it's not an easy thing to do, to apply for DACA and continue to receive it every 2 years.
Vivian, thank you so much. I'm sure that there are questions that people have, so please be putting your questions in. What is most amazing to me is just listening to you, your accomplishments, just looking at you. I mean, my heart just goes out to you in terms of you're just a gentle person. And the idea that you have been living in fear all of these years in the United States, never having broken a law because you came across as a child, so you didn't have the legal competence to even decide to break a law or not as a child, and yet in our own country, you've been living in fear. And I don't know if there's a way to adequately be able to understand what that experience is like, to year after year have your status always kind of hanging over you. I know that's not really a question, that's more of a comment, but I have a question. It could be for either one of you, but you mentioned about how you were able to get an adjustment of status because of the particular circumstance of how you came in and how you were able to marry an American that you fell in love with. What happens if there's a DACA person that doesn't end up marrying an American? How do they get legal? How do they get permanent legal status?
Andre, there is no way. there is no other way. There just simply is not a pathway. And I think with what's happening now with Congress and what they're trying to do is to create a pathway, because unfortunately there isn't.
So what you're telling me is that right now, if someone came over when they were 4 months old and they've been here their whole lives and they grew up in Guilford County and this is their home, they live in fear and they have no hope ever in the future unless something changes, no hope to ever not live in fear or to ever have the US consider them part of the US. Is that correct?
That's right. Everything we've known all of our lives is we're still not US citizen or Americans, even though we would consider ourselves that. I've been living here for 19 years and this is home. I mean, I contribute in every way I can, volunteering. I mean, this is home to me. But you know, for many other people, there's just no way to for citizenship and to not live in fear.
Wow. Wow. We have a question here that it pivots a little bit to the options for the children and the youth arriving now. Do they qualify for DACA, or what is that situation?
Yeah, I can handle that one. And apologies for any background noise I have here. So basically, to qualify for DACA, you have to have come to the United States before you turn 16 and have continuously resided in the U.S. since June of 2007. So nobody that's coming right now has a chance to get on the DACA pathway. Anybody that's coming now is hoping for a chance at asylum, which is a whole other panel that we don't have time to get into, but a very, very high bar to try to prove persecution or threat of persecution in your home country. There are some other pathways, like a special immigrant juvenile status for young unaccompanied minors if they've been abused, neglected, or abandoned by their parents. But DACA is not an option for people who've come since 2007.
So what you're saying is, if there's a child that was brought over by their parents when they were 10 years old or 11 years old, like Vivian came over, but they arrived in 2010, so they'd be 21 or 22 years old now. They don't currently have the DACA situation, so they can't even work. Correct. They can't even get a driver's license. They're in a worse situation than even the DACA situation that Vivian was describing, right?
Right, and that's why for us, you know, when we talk about a permanent solution for Dreamers, it's beyond DACA. We have a lot of young people who can't qualify for DACA, who are pretty much Dreamers as well, that just don't, you know, the dates that were made up back in 2012, their situation doesn't match those dates.
Wow. So, and some of these are mixed status families, right? And so sometimes there'll be an older sibling that will have DACA and the younger one doesn't. Is that right? And
yeah, or, you know, a very frequent situation is the older sibling is a Dreamer without status, maybe has DACA, and then younger siblings were born in the United States and are full U.S. citizens. Maybe parents are still undocumented. So I think that's part of the complication that I think a lot of people don't understand. I think they see it as very black and white. But when we talk about what we should do with the undocumented population in our country, you know, if your solution is deporting everybody who's here without status, well, you can't deport U.S. citizens. So you'd be creating, you know, exacerbating, I'd say, the foster care needs that we have in our country anyway, by adding a lot of U.S. citizen children of undocumented parents into the foster care system. So, you know, the solution of just deport everybody who doesn't have status is not tenable for the social fabric of these communities.
And so the question here, is speaking specifically about Dreamers, is there significant opposition to providing a solution for Dreamers among either the general population in the U.S. or among our legislators? Or is this just more of a question of political difficulties in getting something passed, but most people actually are supportive of a solution?
Yeah, most people are very supportive. It's one of the few issues that polls above 85% across the board from Americans. I think for most Americans, especially if you know a Dreamer like Vivian or someone in your community, it's pretty easy to be convinced that they should stay in our country and be able to contribute fully without fear, be able to pay in-state tuition, for example. You know, Vivian brought that up. North Carolina and Arizona, where I live, are two of the places where currently Dreamers have to pay out-of-state tuition. I know in North Carolina, there's a bill right now in the legislature that would change that. Actually, just yesterday here in Arizona, our state legislature approved putting that before voters in 2022 to allow Dreamers to have in-state tuition. So these are some things that states can do that kind of nibble around the edges, but really we need the United States Congress to finally pull together the will to do what a huge majority of the American people think they should do and pass a permanent legislative solution for our nation's dreamers.
Right. Well, thank you for enlightening us a little bit on this situation. And as well, we'll talk a little bit more detail, but we'll have a chance to go in deeper in the coming weeks on this topic. But I want to bring on board. So thank you both for giving your time and sharing this with us. I want to turn now to Rob Castle from World Relief, right there in the Triad. And he is going to talk to us briefly about refugees and who refugees are, what World Relief does, and how you can get involved with working with refugees.
Sure. Thanks, Andre. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'm glad you guys are here. I want to do a quick kind of overview about who refugees are, just the journey that they've taken to be resettled here in the Triad and other places around the country. And just wanted to invite you all, we are going to have a deeper dive into this in the follow-up. I think it's going to be on June 1st. So I hope you all make it out to that if you want to get a little bit, unpacked a little bit more in a little more depth of understanding who refugees are and how we can support them in our community. But refugees, they are a class of immigrant that are part of the over 80 million people who are displaced in the world, who are forcibly displaced. Refugees are about 26 million of these displaced people. And as Matt said earlier, the formal definition of a refugee is someone who's forced to flee home because of a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Basically, these are people who their countries will not protect them because of who they are or what they believe. They've crossed a border to find safety and they can't return to their homes. And the thing about refugees is it is a formal status and definition applied by UNHCR. That's the United Nations High Commission of Refugees. A lot of times in popular language, we talk about refugees who are fleeing possibly a bad economic situation or a natural disaster, and we'll consider them refugees. But those actually don't meet the definition of a formal definition of a refugee. And those are folks that have left because of fear of persecution from their home country. And as others have mentioned, that the difference between someone who is seeking asylum and a refugee is that a refugee applies for protection from outside of the potential country of resettlement. So as we talk about just their journey, what happens is first they leave their homeland. We've mentioned that it could be because of war. It could be because of a political situation. We have several of our Ethiopian members of our community who fled being conscripted into military service, but they've been forced to leave their homeland basically because of who they are or what they believe. So they've crossed into a neighboring country and they can't return home. Now, when they're in the second country, this host country, what happens is they can present themselves to the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, UNHCR, and then they determine whether they actually are refugees. They'll collect all of their biodata, they'll do some biometrics, sometimes they'll do an iris scan depending on what part of the world you're in, and they'll interview these applicants just to confirm the refugee status and their need for resettlement. For most refugees, this is where that journey ends. Really only about 1%, really less than 1% of all refugees move on to that next step of resettlement. Most stay in the secondary host country. Now you may have seen pictures of refugee camps, and that's your idea of where many refugees live, but really only about a quarter of the world's refugees live in these large camps. Well, that's still a significant number, but a lot of them are living in urban areas. Sometimes they're in countries that allow them to work, sometimes they aren't. And so they're trying to survive in these host countries until it is either they can go to be resettled in another country, or they can return home safely to their own country. But for those that are suitable for resettlement, they can be referred to a resettlement program. Now, this isn't something that they apply for. They actually have to be referred to it either by UNHCR or by a resettling country's embassy. And then that begins this resettlement process. As Matthew mentioned earlier, it is one of the most thorough vetting processes of if you go back to the slide before that, it's one of the most thorough vetting processes we have. In fact, it includes 8 government agencies, including the Counterterrorism Unit, Homeland Security, State Departments, FBI, National Security. They go through 6 separate security databases. They go through 5 levels of background checks. They have 3 in-person interviews. And at any point, if any one person says, hey, I'm not sure about this person, the process ends right there. All in all, this process takes at minimum 18 months. But we see the average stay at a refugee camp or in that host country is about 10 years. And so most people that arrive here in the Triad, they actually fled their country 10 years ago. Some of you a little bit more recently, some further. A lot of the kids that we see that are being resettled in our area have actually been born in a refugee camp, and that's all they've known. They've never known their home country. But if they pass all of these checks, then they're referred to resettlement. And most refugees, they do not get to choose which country they go to unless they've been applied for by a family member through a process called an affidavit of relationship. And so you can't say, I want to be resettled to America. You go into the resettlement process, and then you get divided into the country that's willing to resettle. So you see here that fewer than 1% of refugees were resettled in the United States this year. This past year, actually, that number was 0.07% of refugees were resettled in the United States. We've seen our refugee program fall over the last few years, as many of you know. Just to speak in local numbers, in 2016, Ward Relief Triad across High Point and Winston-Salem resettled 656 refugees. This last year, in our fiscal year 20, we resettled 37. And so you see that's a large decrease, and one that we're excited and hopeful that we're going to see reversed and resettling more in the coming months and in the coming years. But so here's this resettlement process. So they pass all their clearance checks, they pass their medical screening, and they get booked by IOM, which is the Organization of Immigration and Migration, and they are set to arrive. Now, when they arrive, they get into this initial resettlement process, and it's a 90-day period. And the goal that the government gives us is that within 90 days of their arrival, that those new families to our community should be self-sufficient. It's defined by they're able to pay their own bills and things like that. And so this initial 90-day period, we welcome them. A lot of times, this is where we bring our community out, where volunteers and church and community groups will welcome them at the airport and take them to their new home. We do a home visit and an orientation that lets them know what this next 90 days is going to look like, and begin that process of introducing them into American culture and the Triad and public transportation and all of those things. We begin to connect them with what services are available, whether it's social services, or connecting them with Forsyth Tech or Guilford Tech to do ESL classes, getting their kids enrolled in school, whether it's the newcomer school in Guilford County or in the ESL program within Forsyth County, getting to the Social Security office so they can begin that process of getting a Social Security card and work authorization. Now, all refugees come with work authorization, but many employers like to have their Social Security card in hand before they will hire them. And they do go through an initial health assessment at Ward Relief Triad. We also, because most of our clients have had a traumatic past, they also go through a mental health screening just to see if we can help serve them as holistically as we can. And then we work with them on employment, securing that first job. One of the things that we really work with them on is understanding that this is a first step to get this first employment, but also work with them to see what their goals are, what they like for the career. Many of our refugee clients come with advanced degrees from other countries that need to be authenticated, or sometimes they aren't transferable here to the United States. And so we work with them on that, on getting degrees authenticated or re-enrolling in schooling that they need to get their certification here in the States. And then all that's supposed to happen within 90 days. So at the end of the 90 days that they are self-sufficient. But really, it doesn't end there. We don't believe that self-sufficiency is a goal. The goal really is integration. And integration is what we're after when we bring the existing receiving community with our new neighbors together. Integration is where people can be part of the community but still maintain their cultural identity. Really that they can draw on the strength of the community, but also offer the strength of their culture and of their individual lives to the community back. And that really happens through the connections they make with people in the Triad. We mentioned just a little bit how people can get involved here. This is one of the best ways that we've found to assure success of our newest neighbors, and that is a connection with a group of people. I know all of us have a few people in our phone that we can call if something goes wrong, and to be those first friends, to be that support network for someone who's new in the community, to show them where to shop, to show them how the bus system is working in the community, to be that first friend in that support network. That really is the key indicator of stability and success here in the Triad. And I know we don't have much time, but we'd love to connect with you on an individual level and a group level to see how you, your church, your community group could support our newest neighbors here in the Triad. We are, as I mentioned before, we are going to be seeing a lot more arrive in the next few years, and we'll get a little more into that on June 1st. Or we're always open to having that conversation too, if you want to reach out with us as well. But I want to make sure that I leave a few minutes for questions. I know that was a quick overview, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Yeah, so first question is, if someone says, I'm in Charlotte, what connections do you suggest for here? Are there other organizations working in Charlotte?
Sure. As far as resettlement agencies, there is Carolina Refugee Services, and I believe there's a USCIS office in Charlotte as well. And so those are two places. There are also a lot in Charlotte with Catholic Charities and a few other places that are secondary. So they're secondary service providers for those that have arrived. So they aren't involved in that initial 90-day period of resettlement, but then they come along afterwards and they work with them sometimes up to 5 years after their arrival.
Okay, so the best way for them would be just to Google. Can you say the names of those organizations?
It's Carolina Refugee Services in Charlotte, and I believe USCIS has an office in Charlotte. I know Catholic Charities does as well.
Okay, so another question is, do you serve asylum seekers through World Relief Triad? Is that something that you guys do?
We have on occasion. It's not something that we really have a lot of the capacity to do. With asylum seek, now we do serve those that have been granted asylum. And so we have asylees that work within our community, and they are eligible for employment services, for health and wellness services. But for those that are still seeking asylum, we don't actually have the capacity to work with that. We do try to network with folks in the community when we do come across asylum seekers. In our past, we have worked with individuals, but mainly it's been partnering with local churches and seeing how we can work together where we can point them in the correct direction, and a church will kind of work as a sponsoring community.
Okay, and one final question here. In terms of training, do you guys help people know what we're supposed to do to help a refugee, or like how? I mean, that feels pretty daunting to all of a sudden be working with refugees.
Sure, definitely. And we put a lot of emphasis on training our volunteers. We give our volunteers a lot of tools, from just the philosophy of how to work cross-culturally. Everyone asks, how can I be a friend with someone if I can't speak the same language? And there are ways to communicate with people. The actual words we speak is only about 7% of how we communicate. And so we give people tools of how to communicate, both across language barriers, but also across cultural barriers, perspective barriers. A lot of it is understanding that we hold a culture, and so we hold that up with an open hand, and it's an opportunity to learn from another culture. We also do a lot of training on just how to help without hurting, how not to come in with a paternalistic mindset, but to establish real relationships and real friendships. So it's an equal footing that we really strive for, this integration piece, where it's not a benefactor and charity situation, but it's developing true friendships and true relationships for the mutual benefit, mutual transformation of everyone involved.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Rob. And we will be sending out a survey after this. And one of the questions that we're going to ask is whether you would like to be in touch with World Relief and coming out of this. And so you'll have that opportunity, but I'm sure you can also look up World Relief Triad directly, but we'll be sending that information out. I want to thank everyone for being with us this evening. I hope it was informative to you. I know I took lots of notes as I was listening to the speakers. We will have an opportunity to go deeper into these topics with a series of lunch and learns, and that will be happening at noon for the next 3 Tuesdays. So Tuesday, May 18th from 12 to 1, we'll be talking a little bit about what's happening at the border in more detail. We will have the following week, we will go in deeper in with dreamers. And I'm sure there's just so much more. We want to hear some more stories of different dreamers. Vivian will be back with us as well. And finally, we will go deeper in with refugees on June 1st and world relief, and we'll get in more details of that. And so we hope that you're able to make it back for the 3 of those, but if not all 3, then there might be a topic that may be of particular interest to you. And so again, we'll be sending out a reminder, and we'll be asking also about whether you want to continue getting updates about immigration topics, which we have some resources that we would love to share with you. And so be on the lookout for that email. Feel free to invite others to these lunch and learns. We'll be sending out that information shortly as well. But thank you very much for being with us this evening, and I hope that you have a great evening.